Very special thanks once again to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury. As I've said before, it's always a pleasure to work with them, especially on a car like this. And of course, if you want to check out their current stock or chat to them about potentially buying an affordable luxury car, of course, check out the link down in the description, which takes you over to their website. When reviewing something like a classic Rolls-Royce, or a Bentley of the time, or even something more modern like a Maybach, you can't really review these cars under the same parameters typically as a more normal or even high-performance modern car would be, for obvious reasons and maybe some reasons that aren't quite as obvious. Now, my angle for this review is going to be looking at it from the perspective of an outsider, and what I mean by that is actually very simple. If you are already a Rolls-Royce aficionado, if you are in the market to buy another one, then let's be honest, chances are you're not watching this video in the first place, because you already know what you're talking about, you know what to look out for, and you know what you want. That means that this review is appealing to somebody different. And that is my angle. Somebody who maybe isn't a Rolls-Royce superfan. Maybe you've never even considered owning a Rolls-Royce before, but now that you've noticed the prices, at least at the current time, maybe you're curious. Because for a while, and occasionally still, you will see a Rolls-Royce for about 5 or 6 grand, not this model, but some others, and it could be tempting. I was certainly tempted myself, but you kind of think, well, what if it breaks? It's a Rolls. Do you have to get some specialist? Can only Rolls-Royce work on it? Is the engine sealed and locked with a padlock? Is it this dangerous decision to make? Well, yes and no. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. If the car does break, yes, it will be expensive. But the car actually reminds me a lot of a Maserati. My Maserati, for instance, was much newer than this and a totally different kind of car. The only thing it had in common was that it was also a four-door. But the point remains that you should only buy something like a Maserati if you are all in. You have to love the company, love the car, really be willing to put the time, effort, sweat, tears, and crucially cash into keeping that vehicle as you would want it to be. And you need to be prepared to have a little bit of a buffer to pay for repairs, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Now, what I will say in favour of this Rolls-Royce, which is, of course, as you saw from the title of the video, a Silver Spirit II, and I'm going to get into some of the specifics of that model and how it differs from others as well, this is not anywhere near as unreliable as a Maserati, because it was made to be better to begin with. In fact, these engines, a 6.75 litre V8, are good for about 500,000 miles at least, if they're cared for. And that's the crucial difference. See, a Maserati could be treated like a king, and it's still going to break. With a Rolls-Royce, it's kind of a respect-based relationship. It will last if it's treated well and if it's cared for. If you keep the car in good condition, then it will simply last longer. This one, for instance, you can feel it's been loved. The performance still feels like it's brand new, just rolled off the lot. It doesn't feel like it's, creaking excessively or has splits in the seats or suspension that's a little bit patchy, brakes that work when they feel like it. Now, I'm going to talk about some of those things, which of course, to somebody who doesn't drive classics all the time, will be a little bit jarring when you first get in the car. Me, for instance, I tend to focus in on newer vehicles mostly, not classics. So when I got into this car, it took me a good probably 15 to 20 minutes to get used to the suspension alone. And the reason why is because, well, it does feel like a boat by today's standards. You grasp the thin rim, massive steering wheel, and kind of turn it roughly in the direction that you want to go, and the car begins to think about joining you on that journey at some point in the near future. You press the brake, which feels like a massive industrial set of bellows that's stoking a fire somewhere under the bonnet, and it's not so much a braking system as more of a kind of a mail unit, which sends a signed and sealed letter of intent to somewhere down in the engine bay, telling them that you plan sometime within the next month to dock with dry land, and then the car will consider acquiescing to your request. So in other words, plan ahead. You need to turn before you need to, brake well before you need to, and even when it comes to the quote-unquote performance that this car has, well, I will say it's quicker than you'd probably think, but it's no performance car, because of course it wasn't designed to be. However, it is quicker than you might think, and one of the reasons why is because it actually shares more in common with a Bentley than you might usually think of a Rolls-Royce as being. See, Rolls-Royce and Bentley have always had this give and take sort of relationship, with Rolls-Royce being the pure luxury brand for the most part, less so in recent years with stuff like the Wraith, and Bentley of course being the more motorsport and performance arm of that luxury. Typically though, when you go for a Rolls-Royce, it is distinctly Rolls-Royce. It looks kind of like a Bentley, but it's distinctly not a Bentley. This generation though has always kind of, I'll be honest, put me off a little bit because it looks so similar to a Bentley. And you kind of think, well, the Rolls-Royce, I get it, but Bentley has the Turbo R, which is more powerful and faster, even a similar era, similar price. And the reason why is because they're based on the same platform. So it kind of is the Bentley, and the Bentley is this. That is an interesting question that you need to answer for yourself, though. I, of course, can't tell you whether or not you should buy the Rolls or the Bentley, but this generation of those two cars is probably where that question has the most significance. These days, buying a Rolls-Royce Wraith is a very different option to buying a Bentley Continental GT. Back in this generation, it's a little bit more grey. Now, to get back into that performance, that 6.75 litre V8, certainly not lacking for size. The earlier models were carburettor, later had the same Bosch fuel injection system that the Bentley Turbo R has, puts out about 210 to 230 horsepower, which is not bad. Peak power's at 4,300 RPM, so it's pretty lazy, which I like. The torque is reasonably good, between 300 and 350 pound-feet, depending on the model year and who you ask, frankly, and even the weight varies quite a bit from online specs, anything from 2.25 tons to 2.4, so let's say it's around the 2.3, 2.4 ton region. In terms of using one on a daily basis, well, let's be honest, most people probably won't, but if you chose to, is that a viable option? Well, the suspension is still very comfortable. The steering itself, as I said, is fairly wallowy, but it is very comfortable. In a straight line, which is what the car really wants to do, it just soaks up all the bumps in the road, and the reason why is pretty obvious. It has a hydro-pneumatic, self-leveling suspension system with gas-charged shocks as well. It's designed to be comfortable. It's a Rolls, and it does that very well. Probably better than anything else, in fact. In terms of daily costs, though, well, of course, the most noticeable thing is going to be the fuel. It's not as bad as you might think in terms of range, because the tank is fairly big, but the miles per gallon, of course, isn't that great. It is basically a classic after all, so you're looking at about 13 to the gallon, generally speaking. It's a 24 UK gallon tank, that's 107 litres, which means you can get about 310 miles out of it. That's not bad, but of course it's not going to be cheap to fill it up every time, over and over again, if you do choose to use it as a commuter. And that brings me to another crucial crossroads in this review. See, I believe there are two primary groups of people who should consider buying this Rolls-Royce or one like it. Either you are already a Rolls-Royce fan, maybe an aficionado, maybe even a previous owner, maybe slightly older, you like going on cruises with them, taking them to shows, or just using it on the weekend, and possibly even having one as a project car. That is a distinct group, and I would say probably the majority of owners and potential buyers fall under that category. The second group is interesting, because the second group tends to be the people who don't buy one, but consider one. And I would put myself even into this category, because I did consider for a fleeting moment getting one of those cheaper Rolls-Royces. Now ultimately, of course, I didn't, but who knows about the future. That second group, I would wager, is generally a little bit younger, maybe 20s, 30s, sometimes beyond, but you actually do want to think about whether you could use it every day. Maybe even retrofit some components to make it more modern. And I actually believe, as sacrilegious as it sounds, that's not a bad idea when it comes to this car. In a very similar way, actually, to my review of the Mercedes ML55. It's a large, high-performance SUV, and it's one which you can very quickly feel would do great things with modern components. Stiffer springs, better brakes, for instance. To me, the Rolls-Royce feels exactly the same. This feels like a car which was technically kind of foolproofed for the future. A vehicle which was better than its time. They made it as good as they could with the components that they had to work with. But the raw vehicle underneath those components has more potential than the time allowed it to have. And that, to me, is crucial to potentially using one more often than just as a weekend toy. If you were to take this car, remove the entire hydro-pneumatic suspension system, maybe put it on a modernized airbag system from, a donor car, for example, or even like a sports suspension system if you wanted more performance, it will immediately change the characteristics of the car, and not necessarily in a bad way. See, if that hydro-pneumatic system breaks, of course it is a technical component of the car, so it's going to be specialized and it is going to be expensive. In terms of stuff that's less expensive to fix though, the gearbox, for example, it's a GM sourced part. It's actually one of the most affordable things to replace on the Rolls-Royce, and it's a pretty good system. Initially a 3-speed, later a 4-speed, of course automatic, and it is column change, which I personally love. In the States, I know loads of you guys have column change cars, but in the UK it's a little bit rarer, and I find it a lot of fun actually to use a column shifter. To get back to my point on retrofitting the car though, I believe that the suspension and the brakes would make a world of difference to a car like this. Having it uprated to discs all around with more powerful calipers, you would immediately change the entire personality of the car, except you wouldn't sacrifice what makes it good in the first place, which is the comfort and the presence and the pedigree, and also how well built that engine is. Being able to go for 500,000 miles regularly, if the engine is taken care of, is a testament to how well they were made. It is the Rolls-Royce of cars, and that statement exists for a reason. So it is a car which is difficult to pinpoint, I would say, an exact ideal buyer for, but I think that Rolls-Royce's classic ones especially do have a wider audience than you might think. I think the problem is that many of those people who might be a potential buyer who may love the car and use it more than they might ever imagine to, I think they might not even consider it, and that's the problem. See, the obvious choice would be, for instance, like an oil sheik who wants to import them, or a classic British owner who wants to use it on the weekend, as I said, but I think there's this pocket of people, usually in a younger age range, who might actually enjoy the car a lot more than they think they would. Me, for example. Generally speaking, I've reviewed more modern cars, and most of the classic cars that I love, because I am a huge classic car fan, they do tend to be performance-oriented. This, though, was one of those occasions where the longer I drove the car, the more I wanted to drive it. Because after the initial culture shock, if you will, of getting used to that time period's aesthetics and physics and how the car wallows around and kind of decides if it wants to cooperate with steering and brakes, it does, once you get used to that, feel like a pretty great experience. It has a lot of presence on the road. The space, as you can kind of see, is pretty massive. You look out over the bonnet, which is big enough to play polo on, and you feel like you do dominate the road. Even when it comes to interior space, of course it has a lot more rear space than a modern limo or sedan would, because many of them tend to have more aerodynamic shapes now, whereas this was essentially like a big box in terms of its shape and its design. A good looking box, but old-fashioned aerodynamics for the most part. So in the back, the headroom is great. Of course, most of the owners are going to be sitting back there back in the day and having a chauffeur up front. But even up front, there is so much space. The only thing that I will slightly criticise is the headroom isn't quite as good as you might think. You can kind of see that in the video. My head is very close to the roof, and although the seat is adjustable, it can only move so much. In terms of leg room and width room though, well, it's got that for days. In fact, if you have a small pet or a child who goes down into the footwell to retrieve something, say your last goodbyes because you'll probably never see them again. It's a massive car inside. Now, if you are in the market to buy one and you're curious what you need to look out for, there tends to be a couple of consistent things that you can notice about the car as to whether or not it's had a good life or maybe some neglect. Service history is always a great example. If there are large and especially recent gaps, that's not usually a good sign. And you could say that about a lot of cars, but when it's something like this, of course you want to take note of that. That hydro-pneumatic suspension system, it's something which will be costly, so make sure that it works properly, make sure it feels good when you drive it, that it doesn't have some kind of shallow spots or seem to be in and out of operation. And even stuff like pumping the brake pedal a few times, seeing how it feels. And this is the kind of stuff, of course, that you can look on owners forums and Classic and Sports Car Mag and check out for yourself as well. As well as, of course, checking out the obvious stuff like body rust or any leaks under the car if it's been sitting for a while. The usual stuff, really, that you would look for on any car, but of course, when something like this breaks, it will naturally cost more and be more complex to repair than a normal vehicle would, even of its time. So again, just like the Maserati statement that I made earlier, it's the kind of car that you shouldn't buy just for the sake of it. You should buy it if you really want to have that ownership experience. Not necessarily just specifically a Rolls, but something of that caliber. Something that you want to experience, maybe use every day, maybe not, but you have to be all in. If you have, for instance, £16,000 to buy the car, then don't buy the car. If you want a £16,000 Rolls-Royce, have 18, 19, 20,000 and then buy it. Because at least then you have a buffer. It might never cost you that much. It might not cost you anything to fix, because it may not even break. But if it does, you need to have that safety net there, because it can make all the difference between never wanting to see the car again if it breaks and wanting to get rid of it and just forget it, or just getting on with it, getting it fixed and enjoying it again. So it really depends on what you want from the car, how much you plan to use it, and if you want to be all in on that kind of vehicle experience. My verdict is then, it's definitely a car with a lot to offer, even by today's standards. It has potential to be retrofitted and improved even more than it was back then, in my opinion, but you just have to be 100% sure that you want to take that plunge, and as I've said with a couple of other vehicles, some more than others, it is a calculated risk, so you have to decide, is the answer to that calculation worth the risk to you personally? But overall, if you are new to the channel, of course click here on screen to see my other reviews, both for cars and motorcycles, and if you want to keep up with my newer vids, including of course more car reviews, slap not only the subscription box, but also the notification bell, so that you actually see my new vids as soon as they're released. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.